In the middle of a crowded street, with cars rushing by and people passing without a glance, one scene brought everything to a standstill. A 5-year-old girl sat on the cold pavement, clutching her weakened dog in her arms. Her tiny shoulders shook as tears soaked into the fur of the German shepherd, who no longer had the strength to rise. And right there, a group of bikers led by Cole stopped, their hardened eyes softening as unexpected tears welled up. What could have happened to a fearless police dog to leave him so broken, and why did this moment strike even the toughest men so deeply? Before we begin this powerful story, tell us where in the world you are watching from. Share how this moment makes you feel. If this story touches your heart, stay with us, and may your day be filled with hope and kindness. The late afternoon sun slid low behind a haze of tall buildings, casting long shadows across a street alive with rushing traffic, honking horns, and the impatient shuffle of countless feet. The air carried the familiar mixture of exhaust fumes, fried food from street vendors, and the faint scent of rain that had fallen earlier, leaving the pavement slightly damp. Among the blur of hurried strangers moving from one obligation to another, the flow of the city seemed unstoppable, until one fragile image slowed everything to silence. At the edge of the street, close to where the curb met the road, a small girl, no more than 5 years old, sat crumpled on the cold concrete. Her dress, pale beige dotted with faded patterns, clung to her as if holding her small frame together, and her navy scarf slipped down her shoulder, soaked with tears that refused to stop. Emily Carter was her name, a child so young that the city seemed 10 times taller than she was. Her arms, thin but determined, circled tightly around the neck of a German shepherd who lay limp beside her. This was Rex, a 6-year-old K9 with a powerful build, black fur streaked with rich tan along his legs and chest, a harness strapped securely across his body bearing the patch, Veteran K9. Once he had been alert and fierce, the kind of dog that could silence danger with a single bark, but now his eyes stared glassy and hollow, his breaths shallow, his body refusing food and water for days. The loyal protector had become weak and still, and the little girl who trusted him with her life clung to him as if afraid the world might take him away. Her small shoulders trembled violently with every sob, her face pressed into his coarse fur, whispering words that only her heart could form. People walking by slowed to glance at the sight, their eyes flickering with curiosity, even pity, but fear of the large dog kept them at a distance. No one bent down. No one reached out, and so the child sat there surrounded by indifference, a tiny island of grief in a sea of strangers. The bustle of the city continued around her, but within her embrace, the world was falling apart. From down the road came a sudden thunder, not from the skies but from the growl of heavy motorcycle engines reverberating against the buildings. The roar cut through the air like a challenge, sending pedestrians stepping aside with wary looks. Black leather and chrome gleamed beneath the streetlights as a convoy of powerful Harley-Davidsons surged forward. A dozen men astride them, each one broad-shouldered, grim-faced, their presence a warning to anyone foolish enough to cross their path. At the front rode their leader, a man whose very stance commanded attention. Cole Walker was 45, his frame tall and riven with the marks of years spent in fights and on the open road. His hair, dark brown streaked with silver, fell to his neck in uneven strands, and a thick beard lined with gray gave his face an imposing cast. He wore a heavy black leather biker jacket, scuffed with age, over a plain white shirt and dark jeans tucked into boots scarred from countless rides. On his wrist hung a braided leather band, a token he never removed. Behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses, his eyes rarely betrayed emotion, hardened by decades of leading the Iron Serpents, a biker brotherhood both feared and respected on the streets. The convoy slowed as Cole raised one gloved hand, signaling for the engines to quiet. He pulled off his sunglasses, and his sharp eyes scanned ahead, expecting perhaps another fight, another confrontation. Instead, they landed on the site at the curb. A little girl with golden hair tangled across her cheeks, clutching desperately at a dog too weak to lift its head. Cole's breath caught in his throat, the roar of the engines fading in his ears until all he heard was the soft broken sound of a child weeping. For a long moment he did not move, staring as if the city had shifted beneath him. His hand curled into a fist. Leather creaking, memories clawing their way back from places he had buried them. Once, Years ago, he had been a boy not much older than the child before him, sitting alone in the dirt with tears no one cared to wipe away. The world had walked past him then too, and the memory carved a hollow ache through his chest. Seeing Emily, so small and desperate, was like looking into a mirror of the pain he thought he had forgotten. The bikers behind him exchanged uneasy glances. These were men used to violence, to the hardness of the road, but the image of the little girl bent over her silent companion shook them in ways fists never could. Some adjusted their grips on the handlebars, others looked away, uncomfortable with the knot that tightened in their throats. Even the loudest engine seemed muted, out of place beside the fragile weight of sorrow unfolding before them. Cole swung one leg off his bike and stepped onto the pavement, the leather of his boots striking the ground with a heavy thud. He moved closer, his tall shadow falling across the child, yet she did not look up. Emily continued to cling to Rex, her sobs muffled into the thick fur of his neck, her tiny hands clenched as though holding him together by sheer will. Cole crouched slowly, his knees creaking, and lowered himself until he was nearly at her eye level. The muscles in his jaw tightened as he studied the scene, the patch on the dog's harness catching his eye. Veteran K9. This was no ordinary pet. This was a warrior in his own right, brought low by something unseen. The street seemed to pause with him. The pedestrians, who had once passed quickly, now lingered at a distance, curious but hesitant, their conversations fading into murmurs. The bikers shifted behind Cole, waiting for his command, uncertain what to do in a moment that demanded no fists, no growl of engines, but something far rarer in their world. Cole's hand, scarred and calloused from years of fights, lifted slightly before curling back into a fist against his knee. The weight of memory, the echo of his own abandoned childhood, and the sight of innocence crushed by despair pressed against him like a tide. And so the afternoon city, so loud and relentless only moments before, stood still at the edge of one fragile image. A child holding onto a weakening dog, and a hardened man discovering that some battles were fought not with fists or steel, but with the courage to care. The city streets still buzzed with muted life, engines fading into the distance while Cole remained crouched near the girl and her silent dog. The members of the Iron Serpents stood in a loose half-circle, their leather jackets gleaming under the dimming sky, each man unsettled by the sight they had stumbled upon. Emily clung to Rex with desperate strength, refusing to let go, her sobs muffled but unending, her small body rocking gently as if her motion alone could bring the dog back to life. Cole's sharp eyes never left them, and when the sound of heavy boots stepped forward, he turned to see one of his own moving closer with a practiced calm. It was Mason Briggs, the oldest among the Serpents, a 50-year-old former field medic who had traded his military fatigues for a biker's black leather vest years ago. His frame was sturdy, though worn by time, his graying hair cut short, and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses sat crooked on his nose. Around his neck hung an old stethoscope, more symbol than tool, a relic of the life he once lived but never truly left behind. Unlike the others, Mason knelt without hesitation, his weathered face softening as he studied the girl, then shifting to the unmoving dog she held. His voice, low and steady, carried the tone of someone who had seen countless battles but still believed in saving what could be saved. He reached forward carefully, his hand steady despite the tremor of age, and brushed Emily's shoulder gently before focusing on Rex. The German shepherd's body was warm but slack, his breathing shallow, his ears twitching faintly as Mason slid his fingers across the fur at the base of the skull. With practiced precision, he pressed against the skin and frowned, his expression darkening as his touch found something foreign. His gaze flicked up at Cole and then to Emily, who clutched harder as if afraid this stranger might take her dog away. Mason drew back slightly, holding his fingers apart to reveal the faint stain of dried blood and the small mark of a puncture wound. The air thickened around them as the truth took shape. It was no injury of accident. This was deliberate. Mason's jaw tightened and his voice dropped into a grim growl as he muttered what only Cole and the bikers near him could hear. "He's been injected." The words struck like a hammer blow, and the serpents shifted uneasily, their faces twisting with suspicion and anger. Emily buried her face against Rex's neck, unaware of the meaning, but sensing the weight of fear in the air. Cole leaned closer, his broad hand resting briefly on Mason's shoulder, urging him to explain. Mason spoke quietly, his eyes never leaving the small wound. The mark was clean, recent, and too precise to be random. He had seen it before, back in his service days, when animals and even soldiers had been part of experimental trials. His lips pressed into a thin line as he described it, a controlled injection, not enough to kill instantly but designed to suppress the nervous system, stripping away energy and will until the subject became docile. He glanced at Rex's dull eyes and slow breathing and knew this was no ordinary sickness. The dog had been targeted. Cole straightened slowly, his shadow looming over the child, and his mind began to assemble the pieces. Random cruelty could not explain it, nor could accident. This was methodical. He thought back to the streets and alleys of the city. The rumors whispered about vans appearing in crowded places, offering free care or vaccinations to pets, luring in unsuspecting owners with promises too good to question. His jaw locked as he remembered the name Holloway, the old woman who often cared for Emily's dog when Jack was away. A picture formed in his head. A marketplace just days earlier, stalls crowded with people and animals, the air thick with chatter and scent. Two figures in white coats had set up a booth, the sign scrawled with the words, "Free vaccinations today." They smiled kindly, their faces forgettable, their hands quick. When Holloway passed with Rex trotting at her side, they stepped forward, their syringes already hidden in their palms. The act had taken seconds, an injection pressed into fur under the guise of a friendly pat, a few murmured words, a promise of protection. And then Rex had been led away, the old woman none the wiser. But something had gone wrong for the ones who plotted this. Perhaps Rex's canine training, the discipline drilled into him for years, had made him resist. Perhaps the syringe had slipped, delivering only part of the dose. Or perhaps fate had intervened, a twitch, a sudden jerk that prevented the needle from emptying fully. Whatever the reason, the injection had weakened him but not silenced him, leaving him to stagger back to Emily's arms before the trap could be completed. Mason explained this with the tone of grim certainty, his hand brushing once more against the dog's harness as if to anchor the truth. The bikers shifted restlessly, muttering under their breath, the knowledge burning into them that someone out there had dared to use the streets as a hunting ground, turning animals into unwilling subjects of their twisted science. One man spat on the ground, his knuckles white around the grip of his handlebars, but none moved until Cole did. Emily's sobs softened into hiccups as she felt the weight of another presence beside her. Cole bent down slowly, his broad hand lowering until it rested gently on the girl's trembling shoulder. Emily lifted her tear-streaked face at last, eyes red and wet, strands of golden hair clinging to her cheeks. She looked at the tall man looming above her, his leather jacket creased, his beard lined with silver, his eyes filled with something she did not yet understand. He did not speak, did not try to comfort with words he did not know how to give. Instead, his hand remained steady, heavy yet strangely warm, a silent promise forged in the grit of his expression. His gaze met Mason's and then drifted across his men, each one watching, waiting for direction. The street felt heavier than before, though cars still rushed by and pedestrians still passed in uncertain glances. Within this small circle, however, a vow had been made. Cole's eyes narrowed, his thoughts circling the truth that this had not been random. Someone had chosen Rex deliberately, not for cruelty alone, but for calculation. A K9 was disciplined, predictable, the perfect candidate for measuring the effects of whatever poison had been slipped into his veins. The scheme was larger than the wound on the dog's neck. It was the echo of something organized, something that reached beyond a single street. Cole leaned closer to Emily, his face shadowed by the falling sun, and gave the faintest nod, the kind of gesture that spoke louder than any promise. His hand tightened briefly on her shoulder, not to restrain, but to reassure. Emily pressed her face back into Rex's fur, her tears dampening his coat, but in her small chest something eased, a quiet sense that this towering stranger understood. The bikers looked on, their expressions carved with resolve. Mason stood, his back straight, and stepped aside to give Cole space. As the last light of day cast its glow on the pavement, Cole's voice finally broke the silence, low and steady, though meant only for himself and those who stood closest. This was not chance. This was not accident. Someone had marked the dog. Someone had turned the streets into a place of betrayal. And though Emily clung to Rex with the desperation of a child unwilling to lose her dearest friend, the burden now passed to the man who had once been abandoned himself. Cole's expression hardened, his eyes locking with Mason's, his thoughts a vow unspoken. They would find out who had done this, and they would not walk away untouched. The sun had begun to sink lower, stretching the shadows of buildings across the busy street where Emily still knelt with her weakening companion. The bikers lingered nearby in a restless circle, Mason's grim discovery of the injection still pressing heavy upon their thoughts. Cole's hand remained firm on the child's shoulder, his mind turning quickly, the steel edge of decision sharp in his gaze. He knew they could not linger here any longer, not with the child breaking into sobs and the dog's breathing growing shallow. Slowly, he rose to his full height, pulled a phone from his pocket, and pressed a number with deliberate certainty. His deep voice, usually curt and unyielding, softened only slightly as he issued a few urgent words into the receiver before slipping the device away. Moments later, the rumble of a truck engine joined the low throb of the bikers' Harleys. A tall figure emerged, moving swiftly through the parting crowd with a stride that bore both urgency and familiarity. Jack Carter was a man of 42, his frame muscular and scarred from years of service. His dark brown hair streaked faintly with silver at the temples. He wore an olive field jacket, its fabric worn and patched on one sleeve, a dark gray shirt clinging to his chest, jeans faded with use, and boots dusted from long days on unforgiving roads. A black cap embroidered with the word "veteran" shaded his sharp eyes, and a thin silver dog tag glinted faintly against his chest as he moved. His breath was tight with worry as soon as he spotted his daughter's small frame cradling Rex. Jack dropped to his knees without hesitation, his arms circling both Emily and the dog in a fierce embrace. Emily immediately pressed her tear-streaked face into the familiar fabric of his jacket, her tiny fists clutching the cloth as if anchoring herself back into safety. The dog tag at his chest tapped lightly against her cheek, and for the first time since she had collapsed in the street, a small sound of relief broke from her lips. Jack's strong hands gently stroked Rex's fur, his eyes darting quickly to note the shallow rise and fall of the animal's chest, the dullness in eyes once so fiercely alive. His jaw tightened, and when he finally lifted his gaze, it met Cole's steady stare. The world seemed to fall quiet around them as their eyes locked. One was a soldier who had carried the weight of battles across oceans, the other a biker who had commanded loyalty across the unforgiving streets, and yet in that moment, no words were needed. Understanding flickered between them like a silent pact. This was no longer just a child's heartbreak or a random cruelty, it was an attack on something far greater, and both men recognized it for what it was. Cole gave a small, deliberate nod, and Jack returned it, a spark of alliance kindling in the space between them. Without wasting time, Cole barked a brief command, and one of the bikers stepped forward to lift Rex carefully into his arms. The dog gave a faint whimper, his body limp, and Emily instinctively reached as though to pull him back. Jack bent close, his voice low and steady, murmuring words of reassurance meant only for his daughter. She clung tighter, but obeyed, allowing the biker to carry Rex toward a waiting vehicle. Emily stayed pressed against her father's chest, her sobs softer now, though the fear in her eyes had not lifted. Jack smoothed back her tangled golden hair with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the steel in his gaze as he turned once more to Cole. They drove quickly across the city, the roar of bikes flanking the truck like a protective wall. Emily sat huddled against Jack in the passenger seat, her small fingers gripping the edge of his jacket, her eyes never leaving Rex, who lay weakly in the back. At the end of the journey, they arrived at a narrow brick building tucked behind a row of shops, the sign above it painted in fading white, Dr. Hammond, Veterinary Care. The doctor, a man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair and kind, watchful eyes, greeted them at the door in a plain white coat. His lined face reflected both the wisdom of long practice and the weariness of too many late-night calls, but his movements were efficient as he guided them inside. Rex was placed gently onto a steel examination table, his paws dangling slightly over the edge. Dr. Hammond adjusted his spectacles, ran his hands carefully along the dog's body, and finally drew blood with practiced precision. Emily stood on tiptoe at Jack's side, watching anxiously as the crimson filled the small vial, her lip trembling, though she made no sound. Cole lingered near the wall, arms folded, his eyes narrowed, every detail of the sterile room feeling foreign to a man more used to smoke and asphalt. Mason stood beside him, the worry in his expression deepening with every moment. The minutes stretched long before the doctor returned with a clipboard in his hand, his expression grave. He explained in measured tones that the blood revealed traces of a compound something he identified as NEX9, a synthetic agent known to suppress the nervous system. In controlled doses, it could render a subject docile, compliant, stripped of strength and will. He had never seen it used on animals of this caliber before, but the evidence was undeniable. Rex was fighting against its grip, his survival a testament to his training and his bond with those who loved him. The words sank like stones into the room, and Emily buried her face into her father's jacket again, muffling the quiet sound of her fear. Jack's face hardened, his fist clenching at his side, the muscles in his arm taut beneath the fabric of his jacket. Every instinct of the soldier in him rebelled against the thought that someone had turned a loyal companion, a warrior in fur, into a pawn for experimentation. He pressed his lips into a firm line, the fury in his chest boiling but contained, channeled into a silent resolve. Cole watched him closely, recognizing the expression, the way a man carried anger not as fire but as steel. The biker leader gave a single approving nod, acknowledging the soldier's resolve as if sealing the bond that had begun on the street. It was in that silent exchange that the alliance became real. No speeches were spoken, no formal oaths taken, but the room seemed to thrum with the weight of an agreement, forged not in comfort but in necessity. The soldier and the biker, men from worlds that rarely crossed, now shared a singular purpose. The bikers shifted their stance, sensing it too, their respect for Jack rising with the certainty that he would stand with them, not against them. Emily, though too young to grasp the intricacies, felt the change as well. She loosened her grip on her father's jacket just enough to wipe her cheeks with the back of her hand, her eyes brighter, though still shadowed by worry. Before they could leave, Jack bent down to kneel before his daughter, his large hands gently cradling her shoulders. His voice, low and steady, carried the promise of safety that every child longs to hear. Emily listened, her tears drying into faint streaks upon her cheeks, her head nodding slowly as she tried to be brave. She pressed her lips together, swallowing back her sobs, and finally managed a small nod that told her father she understood. Jack kissed her forehead lightly, then rose with the stiff resolve of a man who had chosen his path. Rex was left in Dr. Hammond's care, the doctor promising to do everything within his skill to ease the dog's suffering and counteract the toxin. Emily refused at first to leave, her small hands resting upon Rex's fur, whispering her love into the thick coat. Jack waited patiently until she finally allowed herself to be guided to a chair at the dog's side, where she sat with her hand still touching Rex, unwilling to break contact. From that place she watched as her father and Cole exchanged a final nod, both men stepping toward the doorway, the fading light of dusk painting them in hues of amber and steel. Outside, the sky had deepened into the bruised colors of twilight, the hum of engines waiting like the beat of a restless heart. Emily turned to watch through the clinic's front window as her father walked away beside the towering figure of the biker leader, their shoulders set with a purpose she did not fully understand. She pressed closer to Rex, whispering promises into his fur that he would not be left alone, her small body trembling with both fear and fragile hope. As Jack disappeared into the horizon with Cole and the serpents at his side, the girl sat with her dog, the shadows lengthening around her, a single light burning inside the clinic to ward against the coming night. The night had fallen thick over the city, the air cool and restless, neon signs flickering weakly as the streets emptied into shadows. Inside the cramped office of a detective who owed Jack Carter more than one favor, a grainy video replayed on a small monitor. The footage showed a white van moving slowly along a crowded street, its sides painted with a bright logo that read Pet Community Wellness, a name that suggested compassion but carried a false promise. The timestamp matched the very day Rex had been struck by the mysterious injection. Jack leaned closer, his sharp eyes narrowing, the scar on his jawline deepening as his teeth clenched. Cole stood at his shoulder, arms crossed over his leather jacket, watching with the expression of a man who already knew what the truth would reveal. The license plate of the van gleamed briefly under the streetlight in the video, and that was all they needed. By the time midnight arrived, Jack and Cole had tracked the number through a contact within the biker network, leading them to the edge of the city where warehouses sprawled across empty fields like abandoned giants. The iron serpents gathered at the perimeter, their bikes lined up in silent rows, the chrome muted by darkness. Jack adjusted the brim of his black cap, the word veteran stark under the glow of a lone security lamp. His field jacket blended into the shadows, his fists clenching and unclenching as he studied the corrugated steel structure in front of them. Cole gave a short nod, his long hair brushing against his jacket collar, his beard catching the faint light as he issued orders to his men with subtle gestures. Inside the warehouse, the air was rank with neglect, the stench of urine and decay clinging to every rusted beam. Rows of iron cages lined the floor, each holding a dog in various stages of suffering. Some were too weak to lift their heads, their ribs sharp against thin coats of fur, while others whined softly, their voices trembling with fear and exhaustion. Shadows shifted near the back where figures in black lab coats moved quickly, their hands occupied with syringes, clipboards, and metal trays that clinked in the stale silence. The men wore latex gloves, their faces obscured by masks, their eyes cold and analytical. They recorded numbers, made injections, and ignored the cries of the animals as if they were nothing more than faulty machinery. Outside, the iron serpents crouched low behind rusted barrels and stacks of pallets, their leather jackets creaking softly as they prepared. The night was quiet but charged, the kind of silence that came before a storm. Jack moved ahead, his boots soundless on the gravel, his broad shoulders tense with readiness. Cole raised his hand, signaling for the men to split, sending groups circling around both sides of the building to cut off escape. The faint glow of a cigarette from one of the guards near the door flickered before vanishing as Jack closed in. The veteran lunged forward with sudden force, his fist striking the guard's jaw in a blow that sent the man crumpling silently into the dirt. Jack caught the body before it hit the ground and lowered it into the shadows. Cole's eyes gleamed in the dark as he gestured toward the heavy lock on the door. One of the bikers, a burly man with a shaved head and tattooed arms, stepped forward carrying a crowbar. He jammed the metal into the latch and heaved with all his strength until the lock snapped with a sharp crack. The door swung open, and the sound of anguished whimpers reached their ears. Emily's memory of Rex's suffering echoed in Jack's chest as he moved inside with purposeful strides. His eyes adjusted quickly to the dim light, falling upon cages packed with dogs whose wide eyes shone with fear. His heart clenched, but his steps did not falter. The bikers spread through the warehouse like shadows unbound, their heavy boots thudding against the concrete as they moved from cage to cage. One man wedged the crowbar against the first lock and snapped it open, and the gaunt animal inside stumbled weakly into freedom. Another biker kicked the bars of a cage until they bent and broke, releasing a trembling hound whose fur was matted with dirt. The air filled with the sounds of barking, whimpering, and the metallic clang of cages being ripped apart. Jack moved with them, his strong hands tearing open latches, his voice low and steady as he coaxed the terrified animals out. But the men in black coats reacted quickly, their shock fading into aggression as they grabbed syringes and steel rods from their trays. They shouted to each other and clipped commands, their faces twisted with panic at the breach. One lunged forward, swinging a rod toward a biker's back. But the man turned in time, lifting his helmet to block the blow with a sharp metallic clang. Another lab-coated figure jabbed with a syringe, but Jack caught his wrist mid-strike and twisted, forcing the man to drop the weapon before driving his elbow into the man's chest, sending him sprawling across the concrete floor. The warehouse erupted into chaos, a storm of fists, metal, and fury. Helmets became shields, crowbars turned into weapons, and boots struck hard against ribs and knees. Jack fought with the efficiency of a soldier who had been in countless brawls, his punches precise, his body moving with controlled power. He dropped one man with a kick to the stomach, spun, and drove his fist into another's jaw. His eyes burned with the fire of justice, the fury of a man who had seen too much cruelty to remain silent any longer. Cole waded into the fray as well, his fists like hammers, his presence commanding the battlefield. One by one, the black-coated men fell beneath the onslaught of bikers and the unwavering resolve of Jack. The sound of clashing steel and angry shouts filled the air, mixing with the chorus of barking dogs now freed from their cages. The animals, though weak, seemed to sense the tide turning, their cries becoming louder, more defiant, as though adding their voices to the battle. The lab tables overturned, syringes clattered to the ground, and the orderly cruelty of the warehouse descended into absolute disorder. Just as the fight reached its fever pitch, the night split with flashing lights and the sharp wail of sirens. Blue and red strobes cut across the dark sky, reflecting against the steel walls of the warehouse as police cars screeched to a halt outside. Officers stormed in with weapons raised, their voices shouting commands, the glint of cold handcuffs ready in their hands. Jack stepped back, chest heaving, sweat shining on his brow as the sight of law and order poured into the chaos he and the bikers had unleashed. He had called them earlier, anticipating this very moment, and now their presence sealed the fate of the ones who had dared to inflict such cruelty. One by one, the men in black coats were forced to the ground, their wrists yanked behind them as the metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the warehouse. The bikers stood aside, their chests rising and falling, leather jackets stained with sweat and dust, their eyes still burning with fury, but cooled by the sight of justice being carried out. Cole watched silently, his beard damp with exertion, his eyes flicking to Jack with a faint nod of respect. Around them, the dogs barked wildly, a chorus of voices rising against the darkness, their cages broken, their spirits momentarily free. The dawn broke gently after the storm of the night before, light spilling softly across the quiet town, as if the world itself wished to wash away the darkness that had clung so fiercely. The warehouse raid was behind them, the black-coated men taken away in handcuffs, and the cries of dozens of freed animals had filled the night with a strange kind of victory. Now, the streets were calm again, the city carrying on as if it did not know how close its innocence had come to being stolen. In the courtyard of the veterinary clinic where Rex had been left, the air was different. Not heavy with despair as before, but laced with cautious hope. The scent of morning dew mingled with the faint antiseptic tang drifting from the open windows, and the sound of a child's quick footsteps broke the stillness. Emily Carter ran across the grass with a sudden burst of energy, her little shoes kicking up droplets of water that shimmered in the early light. She wore the same polka-dotted dress, now wrinkled from restless nights, her navy scarf slipping behind her as she rushed forward. Her golden hair streamed wildly, her cheeks flushed with anticipation. Ahead of her, on a soft blanket spread across the ground, Rex lay with his body still weakened but no longer trembling. The antidote had worked through the night, clearing the venom of NAX9 from his veins, and though his legs were still stiff, his eyes carried the first sparks of life once more. The German shepherd raised his head slowly at the sound of her voice, his amber eyes finding hers as a soft whine escaped his throat. His ears, once flat against his skull, perked faintly as Emily dropped to her knees beside him. She threw her arms around his thick neck, her tiny hands digging into his fur, holding him as if she would never let go again. Rex's tail thumped weakly against the blanket, then again with more strength, until it wagged in a rhythm that matched the racing of her small heart. For the first time in days, his tongue brushed against her hand in a tender lick, and Emily's sobs turned into laughter that carried like bells across the courtyard. Her smile lit her face brighter than the morning sun, her eyes glistening not with sorrow, but with joy, as she pressed her cheek to Rex's warm fur. The dog shifted, leaning into her, his breathing stronger now, the fight returning to his body. Around them, the clinic staff paused in their work, their faces softening at the sight. An old nurse wiped her eyes discreetly, while another leaned against the doorframe, whispering quietly about the strength of bonds that no poison could break. Yet Emily paid no attention to the onlookers. The world had narrowed to her and her loyal companion, reunited after shadows had threatened to steal him away. A few steps away, Cole Walker stood with his arms at his sides, his usual armor of indifference cracked open by what he saw. He removed his black sunglasses, and for the first time in years his eyes burned not with fury but with tears he did not try to hide. His tall frame seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of his own memories pressed down in the face of such innocent love. Behind him, the iron serpents gathered in silence, their leather jackets dark and worn, their faces harder than the streets that had shaped them. Yet even they, men who had lived by fists and fire, turned their eyes away as some blinked furiously, ashamed of the tears they could not suppress. Jack Carter emerged from the clinic doorway, his olive field jacket slung across broad shoulders, his cap tilted low against the morning light. He had not slept, the lines on his face deeper, but his step was steady, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. Emily still knelt on the ground, her arms locked tight around Rex's neck, her laughter echoing like a fragile melody. Jack's chest tightened, a mixture of relief and pride surging through him as he crossed the courtyard. When he reached Cole, he stopped, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man whose world was so different from his own, and yet whose heart beat with the same conviction. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Jack extended his hand, strong and calloused, the dog tag around his neck glinting in the light. Cole looked down at it, his beard shifting as his jaw tightened, then reached out with his own scarred hand. Their palms met in a firm clasp, the handshake heavy with the weight of what they had endured together. It was not just respect, not just gratitude, it was agreement, an unspoken oath that stretched beyond words. The soldier and the biker, once strangers, now stood bound by a common cause, forged in the crucible of violence and sealed by the laughter of a child. The iron serpents shifted behind Cole, watching the exchange in silence. These were men who had seen him fight, bleed, and lead without falter, and now they saw him stand beside a veteran in a bond they had not expected but somehow understood. A few nodded slowly, others lowered their heads, but in each pair of eyes was the recognition of something greater than themselves. They had fought for survival, for loyalty, for pride, but now they had witnessed love so pure it had turned even the hardest of hearts. Emily lifted her head at last, her eyes bright, her arms still clinging to Rex. She saw her father standing with Cole, saw the men in leather jackets forming a circle around her, their silence no longer threatening but reverent. She smiled wider, her cheeks glowing as she whispered softly into Rex's ear. The dog's tail wagged harder, his strength returning, his spirit unbroken despite all he had endured. The circle of bikers drew closer, forming a wall of quiet strength around the little girl and her dog, not as intruders but as guardians, moved by something they could not fully name. In that courtyard, under the pale light of morning, a picture was etched that none present would ever forget. A child's arms around her dog, a dog's loyalty stronger than poison, and two men clasping hands not as strangers, but as brothers. The bikers stood in solemn silence, some wiping their eyes when no one was looking, others simply bowing their heads in respect. It was a moment that spoke louder than any battle cry or speech, a reminder that even in a world of cruelty and betrayal, love and loyalty could break through like sunlight after the longest night. And so the image held, Emily embracing Rex in the center, her laughter mingling with the sound of his tail against the ground, Cole watching with tears unashamed, Jack gripping his hand firmly, and the iron serpents forming a circle of steel softened by compassion. It was more than relief, more than victory. It was a symbol, a story that would echo long after the scars of the past faded. For in that courtyard, they all learned that the love of a child and the loyalty of a dog could touch even the most hardened souls, reminding them of the humanity they thought they had lost. At the end of this story, we are reminded that kindness does not always arrive with noise or glory. Sometimes it comes through the tears of a little girl, the loyalty of a wounded dog, or the quiet choice of men who decide to stand together for what is right. True strength is not found in power alone, but in compassion and in the silent sacrifices we make to protect those who cannot protect themselves. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what you are thinking right now, because your voice matters. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of silent heroes, and let us pray that God blesses every viewer with peace, courage, and kindness in their own lives.